Welcome to Boundaries of Expression, a series from Article. Welcome to Boundaries of Expression, a series from Article 19, exploring the challenges to freedom of expression around the world. I'm Jo Glanville. This is the final podcast in our series on Iran. Today, we're looking at harassment online, the range of intimidation that activists and human rights defenders face both inside and outside Iran from the state and its allies. There's evidence that harassment is on the increase. It can include smear campaigns, hacking, surveillance, and direct threats, tactics that chill free speech, create insecurity and fear, and that can lead to self-censorship. Last month, the UN fact-finding mission on Iran warned of an increasing crackdown since the war with Israel in June, with more than 21,000 arrests and mistreatment of minorities and journalists. The UN mission was set up following state repression after the protests 3 years ago, triggered by the murder of Mahsa Amini. To discuss the impact of the harassment, I'm talking to two human rights advocates, Simin Fahandej, the representative of the Baha'i International Community's United Nations office in Geneva, and Azadeh Pourzand, co-founder and executive director of the Simin Fahandej Foundation. The Baha'i community is Iran's largest non-Muslim religious minority. They've long been a target of discrimination and persecution in Iran. The Simin Fahandej Foundation was founded to support the freedom of expression of artists, writers and journalists in memory of the Iranian journalist Simin Fahandej, who was himself a victim of the regime. Welcome, Simin and Azadeh. So it's more than 3 years since the Woman Life Freedom protests and the crackdown that followed that. And we're now looking at a new wave of repression in Iran. And I wonder if we could start by you explaining to me what the climate is like at the moment for people inside Iran. Simin, perhaps I could ask you first.
Hi, Jo, and hi, Azadeh. It's so lovely to be with you both, and thank you for inviting me to this podcast. So really, the freedom of expression in Iran and in general human rights situation in Iran over the past few years has declined tremendously. I don't think I need to say that to your audience. I think we see from religious minorities to ethnic minorities to the situation of women in Iran to really anyone who dares to think differently to the current system in Iran faces oppression of different kinds, including, of course, imprisonment, including access to education, to employment, and of course, as we've seen over the past few years, executions as well. So the situation of human rights in Iran has definitely been in the decline. But I do have to say that when we look at the Iranians in Iran in general, we see that the civic space has grown. We see a growing discussion on not only human rights issues and gender equality, but also growing solidarity between Iranians of different groups and backgrounds together, which is a very promising sign, given that they live in a very restricted environment where they cannot express themselves, they cannot be who they are, they cannot really practice free thinking, freedom of religion or belief or conscience.
That's incredibly encouraging to hear, given the intensity of the situation at the moment. And Azadeh, how's it looking from your perspective?
Hi, and thanks for having me on this podcast. I really second all that Simin just explained, the picture that she painted for us. Unfortunately, when it comes to the situation of human rights, in particular, the situation of freedom of expression, it's a very grim set of circumstances. I would say that repression has intensified not only since Women Life Freedom movement, but also after the Iran-Israel war. Even though that war was a quote-unquote a short one, it's left us with, I think, grave consequences when we are talking about repression. But I also think this is not new. We've always seen waves of intensification throughout the decade with a variety of excuses as external events. So this is not something that the Iranian public is unfamiliar with. It's just, the modalities of it, the sort of phases of this repression, the narratives behind it continue to shift, but at the same time, unfortunately, the Iranian public is well versed in these kinds of methods of repression, whether online or offline. I also want to add that I think over the past few years, what the Islamic Republic has defined for itself as domestic enemy has sort of expanded. Decades ago, there were a certain sort of group of usual suspects. If you are secular and an intellectual and a dissident, if you're a Baha'i, if you're, belong to ethnic minorities or other religious minorities in different capacities, they were by identity, and women as well, by sort of identity, you were a target. But that sort of has expanded beyond the original usual suspect definition of who is a potential threat. And I think, especially as the socioeconomic situation has deteriorated, they're also dealing with socioeconomically challenged groups of Iranians also as potential. And sometimes I think the Iranian government is not only at war now with the women and with the minorities and Baha'is, but also with the poor and with the struggling middle class. So I think, they're trying to survive, and they are not shying away from using whatever method that they can use in order to ensure their survival.
So from the way you're describing it, Azadeh, that's repression that is really capturing the whole of the population of Iran. What we'd like to focus on now is online harassment. And this appears to have increased over the past few years. And I'm wondering, Simin, if you could give us a sense of the kinds of methods that are used. What are the different ways in which online harassment takes place?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Of course, media harassment has existed in Iran for decades, really. But with the rise of social media in recent years, this harassment from hate speech to the harassment of women and others has taken a completely different path in a way, just like, many other countries is the same. It's maybe bullying in another setting. So this online harassment in Iran that we see, the cyber hate, we see that from state-sponsored agencies. There is an Iran cyber army whose sole purpose and existence is to spread hate against different groups and different entities. The Baha'i community, as the largest non-Muslim religious minority in Iran, has been a major victim of this cyber harassment and Iran's cyber army. We've seen, actually, over the past years, every time there has been a moment of crisis in Iran, whether within Iran itself or geopolitically, we've seen the Iran cyber army's efforts increase in spreading hate and blaming Baha'is and using them as a scapegoat. And it is unfortunately one of those areas that people inside Iran do not have a lot of control over, and they don't have the right. And the Baha'is are, one major example of this, that they don't have the right to respond. Now, in many countries, of course, there's this idea of freedom of expression means that you're able to express your thoughts, your views, your beliefs. And if you want to disagree with someone, you're allowed to have that disagreement with somebody's beliefs. But then the other side also has the right to respond. In Iran, this right is taken away from them. And because of the restrictions digitally in Iran, the right for individuals to express themselves is also extremely limited.
Do you see the same kind of patterns happening for journalists and writers, Azadeh?
Yes, as Simin said, unfortunately, the Baha'is have experienced maybe what many of us experience now, for long and in a systematic way. And to a large degree, of course, the intellectuals, the dissidents have also historically, vis-a-vis media, even if it wasn't online, it was offline media, before the internet was a thing. So again, that practice by the Islamic Republic existed. Maybe defamation was not a word back then, but it was basically defamation in print press or in Iranian TV official channels. But over the years, this government has managed to make its techniques for defamation quite sophisticated, as as I experience, and as the individuals and groups that I try to advocate for experience. And in one particular way is that, whereas before it was very obvious that this is the Islamic Republic defaming you as an individual, as a group, now it's become over the years less and less obvious. So basically the smear campaigns, the defamation campaigns are sort of fed, as if, the Iranian government is feeding it in, sophisticated ways with steroid. And it sort of becomes exaggerated, goes to another level. Any small criticism or a question about legitimacy or accountability of an individual, their writing, their reporting, an organization becomes a much bigger scale than it would be in a normal, ordinary discussion online. And so it's sort of intensified in fightings within the opposition. It's intensified in fightings within different targeted, persecuted groups, unfortunately. And it's become to a point that is very difficult, at least for me, who's not a technologist or a security expert, to kind of determine who is who when I go on the online space. It's not always obvious that this is the cyber army of the Islamic Republic. You would need much more sophisticated ways of determining that. And I think that has taken a toll on the morale of the Iranian national discourse online. But at the same time, I like to echo what Simin said, that I'm optimistic in that the Iranian civic space remains vibrant, and especially when you look at discussions from within the country, not the diaspora ones, I see more hope than I do when I look at just the opposition in fightings outside. I think as much as sometimes it's easy to think that the Islamic Republic is winning this narrative war, I actually think at the grassroots level they're not. And that brings me hope.
Well, that's extraordinary to hear, not least given what you've both been describing. And transnational digital harassment, attacks on the diaspora, the Iranian community, that certainly seems to be growing. Is that your perspective, Simin?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there are many Iranian human rights activists outside of Iran that have not received some sort of harassment for their activities. I'm sure if you ask Azadeh and her family, she has stories to tell, and many others as well. So this kind of transnational digital harassment and oppression certainly exists. It exists for activists, it exists for journalists, it exists for those that are active in speaking up, speaking out for the rights of minorities in Iran. I've myself also received these types of harassments. And of course, if you're standing up for human rights and you're also a woman, that adds to the kind of the harassment that you receive as well. And it is a real issue that not only are people restricted from speaking up their minds inside Iran, but also outside of Iran. When they're speaking up, they receive intimidation, they receive harassment, in order to add to that kind of psychological impact of those restrictions, to increase that, to increase essentially the price that somebody has to pay for standing up. And their hope is that if they increase these threats inside Iran against, Baha'is, others, and then to increase that price also outside of Iran, that they can stop people thinking differently, that they can stop people expressing themselves. And I think what the Iranian government has tried to do in a way over the past over 4 decades, by limiting the freedom of expression through these harassment, through hate speech, is to ban thinking, is to ban the deepest part of the human mind and psyche and heart, to stop you from believing what you want to believe and thinking what you want to believe. And what it's really failed to recognize in today's interconnected world is that you can't ban thinking. You can't ban the power of the mind to want to explore, to want to think differently, to want to speak to others, to want to really befriend others. I mean, you see, for example, religious fatwas in Iran that ban association with Baha'is simply because they're Baha'is. But in a world where we're so interconnected, how can you ban this kind of association and this exchange of ideas and this exchange of thinking between people? Because it is really that diversity of ideas that allow for the spark of truth or elements of truth to emerge. And it's that diversity of ideas that allow for a vibrant society, which unfortunately Iran has tried to not allow a diversity of ideas. But we've seen that through the digital world, that has become a thing, as Azadeh and I have been saying, that people are exchanging ideas together. People are getting to know each other, befriending each other. And so then we've seen that digital harassment also increase because of that.
And in fact, the fact-finding mission, the UN fact-finding mission on Iran, has said that it's received information indicating that more than 45 journalists in 7 countries have faced credible threats as a result of reporting on events in Iran. So, as you say, Simin, there's a highly concerted effort to control speech outside Iran. Azadeh, is it something that you're seeing very widely as well?
Yes, and again, I know I keep saying this, but none of this is new. It's just taken a new, way of practice. I come from a background where, as a young kid in Iran, I experienced chain murderings of intellectuals, and we had family friends in Iran being kidnapped and found dead. We had family friends in Germany or other parts of Europe being stabbed to death and shot to death around the same time. So this is unfortunately nothing new, but I think the online form and shape of it is what has very much captured our imagination when it comes to how far a government can go beyond its borders, and how much it can add to people's agony, people who believe in freedom of speech, and sort of what I think is a securitization of speech inside the country has lent itself to the outside. And I think there's a spectrum. So you get anything from defamation campaigns that may not necessarily include death threats, but they definitely have the potential of impacting a person's or families or team members of an institution's mental health, which is actually not something that is talked about enough. I think it's a very serious issue. Most human rights defenders that I see around me, most journalists, most writers, struggle with mental health challenges stemming from their work, from their career, and from a lot of the times, a lot of these defamation campaigns. We have created sort of an informal system of checking on one another, because this is really an issue, because a lot of the times these individuals at the time of being attacked tend to be in an isolated sort of place, or feel like they should isolate themselves. So we've created sort of resiliency around it, but it's a serious issue, all the way to actual death threats, or to feeling like they're being followed, they're being harassed, and a lot of it is very difficult to prove. And so there's also the psychological impact of, am I going crazy and imagining this, or is this really happening? And just feeling very much unsafe for themselves, for their families. And this, in my experience, definitely impact the output and the impact of these individuals, unfortunately, at least for a period of time, until they can rebuild themselves.
So obviously, as you've very eloquently outlined, the impact is emotional, and it's also practical. So it's freedom of expression, but it's the individual inner life of the journalists and writers and activists who are targeted as well. Let's finish by looking at sort of possible solutions to this very complex problem. Obviously, we know that sort of online platforms are working with human rights defenders like yourselves to defend people so that they could speak freely. I also know that Article 19 has offered support in a number of ways, including helping to secure the accounts of people under arrest or getting harmful content removed. What sort of things would you like to see happening that could make a difference, Simin?
Yeah, this problem, the solution to this problem is really, I think, multi-pronged and multifaceted. I think if we look at, for example, at the role of platforms themselves, I think social media platforms have a major role to play in a world of digital harassment, and in particular, digital harassment of human rights activists and those that are really trying to stand up for basic human rights values. I think for social media platforms to really recognize that what's happening in Iran is not isolated, is part of an organized state activity against groups, and really collaborate closely with Article 19, with the Baha'i national community, with other organizations who report cases of abuse, cases of hate speech to them, and really be quick to take down these hate speech content. I know there's this kind of forever discussion about freedom of expression versus hate speech, but also international law is very clear on incitement to hatred that leads to violence, like incitement to violence. And there's many cases where the content that is published is very clearly incitement to violence and incitement to hatred. And so collaborating with organizations and taking down these hateful content, I think at a deeper level, there's need for a cultural shift in Iran, that the freedom of expression is not just the right to speak, but it's also the right to exist and to live without fear. A few years ago, the Baha'i international community organized a campaign called Iran Without Hate, which called for an Iran where everyone, all groups and communities, including the Baha'i community, would live without hate, without fear, where individuals live with state media that not only speaks of social cohesion and encourages values of social cohesion, but also that at the most basic level, doesn't spread hate against them. So I think that cultural shift to see the right of the other, to see the existence of the other as valuable, as respectful, and respecting the differences that exist in society is a deeper, of course, issue that needs to be resolved.
Thank you. Azadeh, is there a single change you'd like to see that could make a difference?
Well, I think I echo all that Simin said, but one thing that comes to my mind a lot is that even those of us or those groups that have the privilege of having access to, the human rights units of some of these platforms, or, organizations such as Article 19 and, other experts that can really help when you're a victim or target of these defamation campaigns. It happens in mode of despair. And if you are privileged enough, you will know where to seek resources, or if people know you, they reach out to you. But I think we need to think, especially for the human rights defender, the intellectual community, and the minority groups that are constantly at the risk of these online campaigns. How can you create awareness so that when it happens, you can already mitigate for the mental shock and the professional elements that go in it, and you can sort of, with more agility, respond to the needs that kind of situation creates, whatever that may be, whether it's the mental health situation, whether it's the security of people, and so on. So the awareness within this community, and then making it less of a taboo, because it still continues to be a taboo even though it's changing. And the other thing is what you are doing, Joe, and what Article 19 is doing. A lot of this stays at the Persian language level, and again, because there is an element of shame attached to it, as well as security perhaps, or lack of awareness, it very rarely becomes sort of in the form of a easy enough to understand for the international community kind of a reportage or a testimony. So I think we need more of these kinds of platforms where Simin and I have the chance to be on.
Well, thank you. And I'm grateful to you both for giving us such a deep insight into what's happening on the ground in Iran, what's happening for you as human rights defenders, and for actually giving us a bit of hope as well in terms of not just the work you're doing, but in the fact that the civic space, despite all these pressures, is thriving. So Simin and Azadeh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really grateful for this opportunity.
You've been listening to Boundaries of Expression, a podcast from Article 19, with my thanks to Simin Fahandej and Azadeh Pourzand. If you'd like to find out more about Article 19's work defending freedom of expression in Iran, and to listen to the rest of the podcasts in the series, please visit article19.org. The podcast was presented and produced by me, Jo Glanville. It was recorded and mixed at Bison Studios, London.